London grass is so nice. Don't you just hate how some people don't know how to take care of it?
Hannah, what do you mean?
Well, let me tell you. Well, let me tell you about this long agricultural debate that's been going on. Okay, so this debate has been going on about various soil management practices, how they affect soil organic matter to achieve maximum crop productivity and long-term soil health. There are 4 current soil management practices, which are reduce soil disturbance, increase plant and soil diversity, year-round ground cover, and living root throughout the year. So the research article I read was done at The Ohio State University by Christine D. Sprunger and some other researchers, called Systems with Greater Perenniality and Crop Diversity Enhance Soil Biological Health. The research was done under the School of Natural Resources, which was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. Overall, the main topic in the main study was to see how different kinds of biofuel crops affect soil health, focus more on carbon mineralization and stabilization. Their main hypothesis was how that crop diversity will increase soil biological health in both the annual and perennial cropping systems, and perennial cropping systems will have a greater impact on carbon stabilization over annual cropping systems.
So cropping systems that are harvested yearly will have less carbon stabilization than cropping systems that are harvested every 2 years or more.
Yes, such as corn, for example, that would be an annual cropping system.
All right.
For their method section, they were able to perform the experiment by looking at 10 different biofuel cropping systems. They looked at 4 no-till annual crop rows, 2 monoculture perennials, and 4 polyculture perennials. They were able to measure the soil health by looking at the permanganate, oxidatable carbon, the mineralable carbon, the soil protein, and the soil organic matter, taking soil samples during the perennial crop's 9th year of growth. So this was a really long, ongoing experiment. So if you look at the graph, the figure on the left shows mineralization carbon for the perennial polycultures were 88 and 23% greater than the mineralization carbon on the monoculture perennials and annuals, which this means they promote more active carbon cycling and healthier nutrient soils, which also helps with soil fertility. And then the other figure on the right indicates soil health and shows the polyculture perennials have a greater epoxy value than the monoculture perennials, which higher epoxy values correlate with more active carbon soil, which also promotes strong soil health. And then across all systems, crop diversity improved overall soil biological health in all annual and perennial systems. If you look at the figure 2, you see that continuous corn had the lowest soil health, correlating with the greatest loss of carbon, showing the downside of monoculture annual cropping. And then one other interesting thing to note is that the restored prairie, like the one right behind us, had poor carbon stabilization despite being one of the most diverse, but that's likely due to nutrient limitations and no nitrogen for fertilizations.
So because there's less fertilizations from like direct farmer input, we get less nutrients kind of artificially placed into the soil.
Yes, exactly. And to tie this back to what I initially started talking about the different practices, increasing all 4 ways of soil health management is the most effective way to increase soil health, nutrient mineralization, and carbon stabilization.
But that does kind of differ from our class discussions about maintenance disturbances and kind of prairie lands, because we've recently kind of been talking about burning prairie lands as a way to re-release kind of the nutrients that are locked into those back into the soil.
So there's a difference between disturbance management and then the agricultural management, where disturbance management goes in and actively burns, trying to recycle those nutrients, while the agricultural management is more leave it be and let nature take its course.
Sure. So that kind of point of prairie diversity is really interesting to me, Hannah, because I feel like the way that we've currently been talking about managing prairies, especially like in agricultural settings, has kind of been disconnected from grazing. I recently read a paper about grazing in Italy. So we're going all the way across ocean to get here, that looked at how different grazing intensities impacted the diversity of flowers in different farmlands. This study specifically looked at semi-natural grasslands, which are grasslands that already experience a small amount of disturbance, and how abandoned grazing, moderate grazing, and over-intense grazing are impacting the flower diversity and pollinator diversity in those areas, and how we can relate that to ecological resilience and future farming management practices.
Yeah.
So the hypothesis of this specific study focused on three main things: that grasslands will show a higher trait diversity than with moderate grazing than abandoned, because it will be able to weed out more dominant species; that moderate grazing will increase flower trait diversity because it will remove the kind of competition that we normally see; and that grazing will mediate species diversity by, again, broadening the traits and then the more rare species that we're able to get in these areas. So this study looked at 11 farms and 116 sites in Switzerland and Italy to measure the current flower diversity and then the current and slightly historical grazing regimes found in each of these areas. They summed this up with this graph here, which looks at taxonomic and fundamental diversity over specifically moderate grazing, and then common weighted mean diversity over specifically moderate grazing. They focus on moderate grazing because they actually found that moderate grazing was that really good balance point to get the most diversity, with too little grazing not really making any impact on the dominance of flowers, and then too much grazing over removing those species and leading to kind of barren grasslands.
Yeah.
The figure here shows intermediate disturbance peaking the most over all of the indexes that they measured with moderate grazing, with the first graph looking at taxonomic diversity, which is kind of the overall diversity of plants, showing an increase with moderate grazing, and then fundamental diversity, which is the specific niche that plant fills, also showing an increase. And then the second graph showing that the common weighted mean, which is the overall diversity and presence of all of these plants over this landscape, showing a much more even and less dominated landscape.
What are the red and green arrows pointing to the same pictures?
Yes, so that isn't a statistical error. Those are two different indices that are kind of measuring opposite things. The Shannon index is measuring the species diversity of all of these plants. So when you see that green going up, it's showing an increased diversity. And then the Simpson index, which is the second one with the red arrows, shows the dominance of plants. So when that's negative, we actually see a more even spread of plants across the landscape.
Well, that makes sense.
So the overall conclusion that was so heavily supported by that data was that moderate grazing is so good for biodiversity and resilience in these Italian semi-natural grasslands, and that these authors then start to infer that this type of grazing regime would actually be really beneficial for all semi-natural grasslands kind of across the globe.
How did they know that with the data, since this was only done in Italy and Switzerland?
So that's kind of where we start running into issues, is because this is only done in Italy with only one site being done in Switzerland, and all of then a majority of these samples being done in central Italy, with you have coastal implications, you have specific species implications. The generalizations that these authors are trying to make do kind of become more difficult. They don't measure soil health, they don't measure weather impacts, they don't measure, even as much as they talk about pollinator impacts, the presence of pollinators before, during, or after sampling. So although I do believe that what they're saying is true, and that the grazing regimes that they have observed from all of these farmlands are creating an impact on flower diversity, it's not as generalizable as I think they're making it out to feel, because agricultural land here in Wisconsin, with the plants and the pollinators that we currently have, is going to behave differently than this Italian land.
Len, now that we know so much about grazing and soil health, I think we should start our own farm.
You know what, Hannah? I think you're right. Let's go.